My son called me on a Thursday morning to tell me he had sold the lake house. Not asked, not suggested, told. Lucas said, "Mom, I have some news. The lake house. I found a buyer. We signed last week. It was the right time." I said nothing for a moment. We signed last week. Last week. The lake house that Richard and I had bought in 1989. The lake house where Lucas had learned to swim, where we had spent every August for 22 years, where Richard had sat on the porch on the last summer before he died and said, "This place is exactly what a place should be." Lucas said, "Mom, are you there?" I said, "Yes, I'm here." Lucas said, "I know it's a lot to process, but the market was right and the offer was strong and I thought—" I said, "Lucas, who owns the lake house?" He said, "Well, we signed the papers, so technically the buyer—" I said, "Lucas, who owned the lake house before the buyer?" Silence. A long silence. Lucas said, "You did, but I thought, the family trust. I assumed." I said, "You assumed?" He said, "Mom, I said, "Call Patricia. She will be expecting your call." Lucas said, "Why would Patricia be expecting—" I said, "Because I called her 6 months ago, Lucas." I said, "When I heard you were looking for buyers. My name is Eleanor Brooks, 62 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher. I have one son, Lucas, 38 years old, and I had a lake house." Had. Past tense. According to my son. Let me tell you about the lake house. Richard and I bought it in 1989. We had been married for 7 years. Lucas was 3 years old. We had saved for 4 years for the down payment. Carefully, deliberately, the way Richard and I did everything financial. We drove up on a Saturday in April to look at it, and Richard stood on the porch and looked at the lake for approximately 90 seconds and said, "This is it." We bought it the following week. We spent every August there for 22 years. Lucas learned to swim in that lake. He caught his first fish from that dock. He had his first serious conversation about his future sitting on that porch with Richard at 16. He brought Nicole there the summer before they married, and she had stood at the water's edge and said it was the most peaceful place she had ever been. Richard died in the 9th year after we bought it. He sat on that porch the last summer before he died and said, "This place is exactly what a place should be." I have thought about that sentence many times since. After Richard died, I kept the lake house. Not from sentiment exactly, from the understanding that some things are worth keeping because of what they represent. Not nostalgia, continuity. The particular thread that runs through a family's life and holds it together across the years when everything else is changing. I kept it. I maintained it. I paid the property taxes every year. I opened it in May and closed it in October. I went up alone for 2 weeks every August because August at the lake was something I was not willing to give up simply because the person I had done it with was gone. Lucas came occasionally, less in recent years. He had mentioned 3 times in the past 18 months that the lake house represented a significant asset that was not being fully utilized. He had mentioned that the property market in that area had appreciated considerably. He had mentioned that if the goal was to preserve value for the family, there were more efficient vehicles than a seasonal property with carrying costs. I had listened. I had said, "I'll think about it." What I had actually done was call Patricia. Not immediately, 2 weeks after the 3rd conversation. When the pattern of the 3 conversations became clear to me, Lucas was not raising a financial observation. Lucas was building towards something. I called Patricia. I said, "The lake house. I want to review the ownership structure." Patricia said, "When do you want to come in?" I said, "Tomorrow." I went in the next day. We spent 2 hours reviewing the ownership structure of every piece of property connected to my name. The house on Birchwood Lane, the lake house, 2 smaller investment properties I had acquired in the years after Richard died. The lake house had been held in a family trust, a trust structure that Richard and I had established in the early 90s, well-intentioned, designed to facilitate eventual transfer to Lucas, but structured in a way that, Patricia said this carefully, could be interpreted as giving Lucas certain rights as a beneficiary that he had apparently chosen to interpret as authority. Patricia said, "He does not have authority to sell," but the structure is ambiguous enough that a buyer's attorney might not have caught it immediately. I said, "Change it." Patricia said, "I need 48 hours." I said, "You have them." 48 hours later, the trust had been restructured. The lake house was in my name alone. A single owner. No ambiguity. No interpretable beneficiary rights. Mine. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of Lucas not mentioning the lake house again. 6 months of Sunday dinners where I watched him carefully and said nothing. 6 months of waiting. And then, Thursday morning. "Mom, I have some news." "The lake house. I found a buyer. We signed last week." We signed. As if he had authority. As if the restructuring had not happened. As if 6 months of silence meant the situation had not changed. He had found a buyer and signed papers without checking whether he had the right to sign them. Without calling Patricia. Without asking me. Without a single conversation. If you have ever watched someone move towards something and said nothing because you were waiting for exactly this moment, stay with me, because what happened when Lucas called Patricia is something worth hearing completely. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week. Lucas called Patricia at 9:47. I know the time because Patricia texted me. "He called." Putting him on hold. "Calling you first." I said, "Tell him everything." Patricia said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Tell him everything. Clearly. All of it." Patricia said, "Understood." She called me back 22 minutes later. Patricia said, "He is upset." I said, "Tell me." Patricia said, "He believed he had authority under the original trust. He had a real estate attorney review the original documents, and the attorney confirmed, based on those documents, that as primary beneficiary, he had rights that could be interpreted as transfer authority in certain circumstances." I said, "But not under the current documents." Patricia said, "Correct. The restructuring 6 months ago removed that interpretation entirely. The lake house is yours solely and completely. The sale he conducted is not valid. The buyer's funds are in escrow. The buyer's attorney is already on the phone with me." I said, "What does the buyer's attorney say?" Patricia said, "They are unhappy, but they are professionals. They understand that the seller did not have authority. They want resolution." I said, "What does resolution look like?" Patricia said, "The sale is unwound. The escrow is returned. The buyer walks away. Lucas potentially faces a claim from the buyer for costs incurred. Attorney fees, inspection fees, the costs of a transaction that should not have proceeded." I said, "And Lucas?" Patricia said, "Eleanor. He forged ahead on a sale without confirming current ownership documents. His attorney should have caught the restructuring. His attorney did not. That is a conversation Lucas needs to have with his own attorney." I sat with that. Lucas had found a buyer. Lucas had engaged a real estate attorney. That attorney had reviewed documents. The attorney had reviewed the original documents, not the current ones. 6 months of silence, and Lucas had assumed the silence meant nothing had changed. He had not checked. He had not called Patricia. He had not asked me. He had found a buyer and signed papers and called me on a Thursday morning to tell me he had sold my lake house. I said, "Patricia, the buyer, are they local?" Patricia said, "A family from Boston, 2 young children. They had been looking for a lake property for 3 years." I said, "What did they pay?" Patricia said, $480,000. I sat with that too. $480,000. For Richard's lake house. For the place that was exactly what a place should be. For the August mornings and the first fish and the porch conversations and the last summer. $480,000 that Lucas had accepted and that was now sitting in escrow because the seller had not had authority to sell. My phone rang. Lucas. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. I said, "Yes." Lucas said, "Mom, Patricia told me about the restructuring." I said, yes. Lucas said, you did this 6 months ago. I said, yes. Lucas said, why didn't you tell me? I said, why didn't you ask me before signing? Silence. Lucas said, I thought I had the authority. My attorney confirmed. I said, your attorney confirmed the original documents, not the current ones. Lucas said, because I didn't know there were current ones. I said, because you didn't check. He said nothing. I said, Lucas, you found a buyer for my lake house. You engaged an attorney. You signed papers. At no point in that process did you call me to ask whether I wanted to sell. At no point did you call Patricia to confirm the current ownership structure. You assumed, and the assumption was wrong. Lucas said, the market was right. The offer was strong. I thought you'd be pleased. I said, you thought I would be pleased that you sold my lake house without asking me? He said, I said, Lucas, that house is where your father said, this is it. That house is where you learn to swim. That house is where I go every August because August at the lake is mine, and it is the last thing that is entirely mine from the life your father and I built together. Silence. A different kind of silence this time. Lucas said, Mom, I didn't think about it that way. I said, I know. I said, that is the problem. He said, what happens now? I said, Patricia will unwind the sale. The buyer will be made whole for their costs. You will address whatever claim your attorney's error creates, and then you and I are going to have a proper conversation about the lake house, what it is, what it means, and what will eventually happen to it when I decide the time is right. He said, when will that be? I said, when I decide. Not when the market is right. Not when an offer is strong. When I decide. He said, and the buyers? The family from Boston? I said, what about them? He said, they have 2 young children. They've been looking for 3 years. That is someone's dream house, Mom. I said, yes, it is mine. He said, I know, I said, Lucas, I am not selling the lake house today. That is my decision. But I heard what you said about the family. I will think about it. He said, really? I said, I will think about it. That is not a yes. That is a woman telling you she heard you. He said, okay. He said, Mom, I'm sorry. I said, I know. I said, call your attorney, then come for Sunday dinner. We will talk properly then. He said, okay. He said, the restructuring. 6 months ago, you knew I was heading toward this. I said, I suspected you were building toward something. I prepared for it. He said, why didn't you just tell me? I said, because I needed to know whether you would ask me first. He said, and I didn't. I said, no, you didn't. If this moment reached something in you, if you have ever had someone make a decision about something that was yours without asking, leave me a comment. Tell me what it was. Tell me what you did. I read every single one. Sunday dinner was quieter than usual. Lucas arrived alone. Nicole had a family obligation, or so he said. I did not press. Some absences are their own kind of communication, and I had learned to read them without requiring explanation. He sat at the kitchen table while I finished the meal. He did not offer to help. He usually does. Tonight he sat with both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table in the way he looks at things when he is working through something that has not resolved yet. I put the food on the table. I sat down. I said, tell me what happened with your attorney. Lucas said, the buyer's attorney has filed a claim for costs, inspection fees, attorney fees, the carrying cost from the time the funds were in escrow, approximately $11,000. I said, and your attorney? Lucas said, my attorney acknowledges the error. They did not pull the current documents. They should have. We are in conversation about responsibility. I said, that is your situation to manage. Lucas said, yes. I said, Patricia has confirmed the sale is fully unwound? Lucas said, yes. The buyer received their escrow back plus the $11,000 from my attorney's insurance. They are whole. I said, Good. Lucas said, they were gracious about it, the family. Patricia spoke with their attorney, and apparently they said they understood that these things happen. I said, they are good people. Lucas said, yes. We ate for a few minutes in the particular quiet of a table that has something unfinished on it. Then Lucas put down his fork. Lucas said, Mom, I want to say something. I said, say it. Lucas said, I went about this completely wrong. I found the buyer and I let myself believe that the doing of it was the same as having the right to do it. I told myself you would see the number and understand it was a good decision. I told myself I was handling something practical that needed handling. He looked up. Lucas said, I was doing what Nicole does, what I have watched Nicole do, making something done before anyone could object. I looked at my son. He said, I recognized it when Patricia told me about the restructuring, the 6 months. You knew. You prepared. You waited to see what I would do. I said, yes. He said, I did exactly what you were waiting for me to do. I said, yes. He said, and you had already made sure it couldn't work. I said, I had made sure the property was correctly protected. What you did with that information was your choice. Lucas said, I chose wrong. I said, yes. He said, I want to ask you something. I said, ask. Lucas said, the lake house. What is your actual plan for it? Not today. Long term. What do you want to happen to it? I looked at my son across the kitchen table. 38 years old. The boy who had learned to swim in that lake. The man who had just tried to sell it without asking. I said, I want to keep it for as long as keeping it makes sense. I want to go up every August. I want Emma to bring Ryan there next summer. I want Daniel to take his photographs from that dock because the morning light on that water is something he has not found anywhere else. Lucas said, and eventually? I said, eventually it will pass to you. When I decide the time is right and when I am confident that whoever receives it understands what they are receiving. Lucas said, a place, not an asset. I said, yes, a place. Richard's place. Our place. The place where you caught your first fish and had the conversation at 16 that I could hear from the kitchen window and chose not to interrupt. Lucas said, I didn't know you could hear that. I said, I could hear it. I chose to let you have it privately. That is a different thing from not knowing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the family from Boston. I said, yes. I have been thinking about them. Lucas said, 2 children, 3 years of looking. I said, yes. I said, I called Patricia on Friday. Lucas said, about what? I said, I asked her to have their attorney provide the family's contact information. I wrote them a letter. Lucas said, what kind of letter? I said, a letter explaining what happened, that the property was not correctly authorized for sale, that I am the owner and I did not authorize the sale, and that I am sorry for the disruption to their search. Lucas said, you apologized to them? I said, they spent 3 years looking for a lake house. They found one they wanted. They paid escrow. They had inspections done. They told their children they had found it, and then it was unwound through no fault of their own. Yes, I apologized. Lucas said, is that all you said? I said, no. I reached into the folder beside my chair. I placed a document on the table between us. Lucas looked at it. It was a letter from Patricia's office. 2 pages. I said, I also told them that when I am ready to sell, when I decide the time is right, they will have the first option to purchase at fair market value, before any listing, before any other buyer. First option, in writing, registered with Patricia's office. Lucas read the document. He read it slowly. When he finished, he looked up. Lucas said, you gave them a right of first refusal. I said, yes. Lucas said, for how long? I said, for as long as I own the property. Lucas said, why? I said, because they are good people who got caught in something that was not their fault. because they have 2 children who need a place to learn to swim, because Richard would have liked knowing that eventually, when the time is right, that lake would have children on it again. Lucas was very quiet. He looked at the document. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." He said, "You think he would have?" I said, "I know he would have." He loved that lake because of what it did to people who sat beside it, not because of what it was worth. Lucas put his hand flat on the document. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. For all of it. For not asking. For not checking. For thinking the number was the point." I said, "I know." I said, "Lucas, the number is never the point. You know that. You have always known that. You just forgot it for a while." He said, "I won't forget it again." I said, "I know." I said, "Now eat your dinner. It is getting cold." He picked up his fork. We finished the meal. We did the dishes together, the way we have done them since he was 12 years old. Him washing, me drying, the particular rhythm of a task done together so many times it requires no coordination. He said at the end, "The right of first refusal. The family will be happy." I said, "Yes, I think so." He said, "They will wait." I said, "Good things are worth waiting for." He dried his hands. He said, "Like you waited 6 months." I said, "I waited until I needed to. That is all waiting ever is." It is Tuesday morning. The lake house is mine. The family from Boston received my letter on Friday. Their attorney called Patricia on Monday. He said, "They are grateful. They will wait." Patricia texted me those 4 words. I read them at the kitchen table with my coffee. They will wait. Good. So will I. Lucas made his first payment toward the buyer's costs on Monday. $11,000 divided into monthly installments. His attorney's insurance covered the majority. Lucas chose to contribute personally regardless. He did not tell me this. Patricia told me. I did not tell Lucas I knew. Some things are better received quietly. The lake house will open in May. I will drive up on the first Saturday. I will unlock the front door. I will stand on the porch and look at the lake for exactly as long as I need to. I will think about Richard saying, "This is it." I will think about a 3-year-old learning to swim. I will think about a 16-year-old on this porch having a conversation he did not know I could hear. I will think about a family in Boston who has been looking for 3 years and who will wait for exactly as long as it takes. A lake house is not an asset. It is a place. The difference between those 2 things is everything. My son forgot that for a while. He remembered it on Sunday over cold dinner and warm dishes. That is enough. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever tried to take something from you that was not theirs to take? Not out of cruelty, but out of forgetting what it meant? Tell me what it was and how you handled it. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you today, subscribe, because next week's story will stay with you too.